Thank you, and thanks for coming, and thanks for staying. These are two things you might not normally see in a title, and hopefully you'll see why as we progress. Acknowledge my co-author Janet Hodgetson, Jane McMecking, who I don't think she's here at the moment. So other acknowledgements, there's a cast of thousands because it was a very much a cross-disciplinary, or ended up being very much a cross-disciplinary piece of work. It started out as a fairly narrow brief funded by the Ministry for the Environment, and they sort of got what they wanted, but I hope they got a lot more. So our main message is that, consistent with some of the themes we have here, everything is connected to everything. Stream bank erosion is not just caused by water running downhill and the local channel hydraulics. It's actually an emergent property of a broader system and a self-organising system. So catchments are self-organising systems, and socio-economies are self-organising systems. And there are feedback loops and interactions between the various components of these systems, and they're not necessarily included in many of the mechanistic models or models that are built on mechanistic views of catchments that are used to allocate resources to remediation. Another message that's a bit contentious is riparian protection will address the symptom, that's the erosion of the stream bank, but it won't necessarily address the cause. And the causes, I'm talking about broader scale causes again. And we would recommend that problems like this of socio-ecological nature, that we move to a systems approach involving lots of inputs and lots of ways of looking at things and lots of knowledge systems, which are much messier than we'd like, but that's where we need to go. So what the initiation of this project was the problem conceived that stream banks are a source of problem sediment all around New Zealand. There are a few relatively favourite simulation models used for sediment modelling sediment budgets, and therefore allocating resources to remediating the problems. And there's a perceived knowledge gap, particularly with the way that the models represent stream bank erosion for New Zealand, but particularly for Southland, because we have different types of catchments and different types of streams. So the Ministry for the Environment gave us some money to look at how we could improve the algorithm that represents stream bank erosion within the SEDNet model. And at that time we thought we had some information existing within our organisation and probably built up from the previous Southland Catchment Board that could help advise this. However, what we found, delving back into the literature and the history, was a bajillion things. And I don't have my pointer, so you'll just have to put up with that. So there's a lot on this page for good reason, and it's more or less in chronological order, coming from European settlement. There's also a much longer and richer history of Polynesian settlement before that, but starting at European settlement, got clearing, gold mining, grazing and burning. All these things have an eventual effect on stream bank erosion, directly and indirectly by changing the hydrology. As we heard in previous talks, most of lowland Southland has been drained by river cuts and subsurface drains. Wetland removal on the left there in the second line, you'll see what the amount of wetland we had, now the amount of wetland we have, which is only a few percent. And this type of drainage had resulted in widespread flooding. It's not just something that happened here all the time. It happened, but it had a much lower consequence because of the retention of the wetlands and less urban environments on the lowlands. Shortening and straightening of rivers hastened the water exit from the landscape, flooding again in the 70s, 80s. Riparian veg removal, and also on the floodplains, because that was actually retarding the flow, leaving the region. We want to speed up the flow because there is too much water in Southland. Flood channel revegetation removal, gravel mining has been a big thing. It's happened on basically all the main stem rivers and a lot of the second order rivers, and that has changed the nature of the river and the speed of the water and how it moves, and has affected stream bank erosion. Stop banks are put in for flood protection, again speeding the water up. Surface drains exist to take the water away from the subsurface drains and any runoff, and they collect sediment, so there's routine maintenance of those to dig the sediment out on a 1 to 5 year rotation. So they're maintained to keep the water away. Land management changes, flow regulation in the Waiau, and the other thing that we reviewed in for this project is systems thinking as opposed to mechanistic thinking. So it moved a fair way from the initial brief to look at an algorithm, advising an algorithm in a model. So to summarise a lot of that in a cartoon, the cylinders and the troughs there are a catchment, if you like. The cylinders represent the storage capacity in the uplands, in the hill and high country, the hill country, B in the lowlands, and the flooding is interconnected with the lowland streams. And you had a flow hydrograph a bit like that one down the bottom. What we ended up with was reduced storages, the disconnection of the lowland streams from the floodplain, and increased overland flow in the uplands, increased artificial drainage in the lowlands, and a change to a hydrograph that's a bit more flashier. So the water gets away faster. And evidence for this is from the Makariwa catchment before and after the design of the flood alleviation scheme. And the white bars represent the peak flows of the flood return periods before the scheme, so that's from data from 1960 up to 1960. And the light grey bars are what they designed for the scheme, so they shortened the river and they steepened it, what they designed for the flood peak flows for those return periods to get the water away and reduce flooding. And the tall grey bars are what we actually ended up with. And the hypothesis is that that difference between the two grey bars is the combination of the flood scheme getting the water away quicker, possibly under-designed because that is now scouring significantly by metres. The bed is being degraded by metres in a lot of those areas. But also the original design did not take into account all the other drainage and vegetation removal that goes into actually water away quicker from the landscape. So we have much higher peak flows than that system was ever meant to hold. And a lot of you may be aware of the account of the Southland Catchment Board up until 1990, which had that title, and while water flows, Southland grows. So getting the water away was seen as good for Southland. We need to think about the whole system, and again, just remember we started with a very, very small brief to talk about stream bank erosion, but we're blowing it out now to what are the socio-economic controlling variables, and we saw some of those in the last slide. All these things of changes of industry and landscape and river management have actually ended up with the type of stream bank erosion as one example of erosion that we have now. So the other thing to take into consideration is disequilibrium and timescales. The catchments that we have now are estimated to be nowhere near equilibrium. They're probably decades or even centuries away from coming to an equilibrium state. So the wisdom of using a steady state annual average model, I'm not saying it's useless, but just it needs to be taken into consideration with the timescales. And the thresholds and transformations which we'll hear more about when we talk about resilience. So think about the whole system, causal interactions and feedbacks between those things, and the fact that they exist at different scales. Oh, no, sorry. Confused myself there. So here we're getting to the nub of it. Here, if you like, I put this up as a hypothesis, but I was thinking these things actually happen. I was caught up in one of these loops more than once in my life, where there's a feedback between funders and modellers, and where the model and the worldview can end up with some sort of circularity. And we can talk about that another time. But this is nice and neat, but one of the risks of having a model with only, say, 2 sources of sediment in it can facilitate blame. It's not me, it's not hill slope erosion, it's obviously stream bank erosion. Stream bank erosion is fine, it must be coming from somewhere else. What are the options? Oh, it's from farms. When really the story is a lot more complex, as I showed you with that history. What we're tending to move towards within Environment South and also with our engagement is to have a much more systems thinking approach with many more actors, where models form an important but much smaller part of the overall social process and not the other way around. The social process should not feed the model and the data collection should not be for the model's sake. And this is messy, but there's a shared responsibility. We all have had a part to play, continue to have a part to play in the socio-ecological problems. So these are the main messages which we have had early on, but the 2 that probably didn't come out was to abandon blame. Pointing fingers and using tools to share blame is probably not productive. But to learn from the Mātauranga Māori worldview that things are connected and humans are part of the ecosystem. And finally, those last 3 lines, we recommend a much more holistic approach to things. And at this point, I'll take another shameless opportunity for advertisement. There's a poster on resilience and changes to hydrology and drainage. And this will hopefully feed into another theme that we'll be talking about in the discussion panel. And you may see some links here with using the word economy with the presentations made by Emma and the fact that she'll be talking about taking a systems approach as well.